On the 10th of June 1944, along this roadway between Omaha and Utah beaches, outside the town of Carentan, men of the 101st Airborne Division fixed bayonets, rose from cover and charged towards waiting German paratroopers. Under a hail of fire and in hand-to-hand combat, they gained a vital foothold in one of the key locations in the battle for Normandy. But just why was it so important, and how was it achieved? To answer those questions, we can draw on this unique historical record, an interview with the very man who led the assault, 29-year-old Texas native Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole. His insights, given just weeks after the action on the very ground itself, provide a fascinating commander's eye view into the legendary assault along what is today known as Purple Heart Lane. When on the 6th of June 1944, Operation Overlord had commenced along this 50-mile stretch of Normandy coastline, all involved knew the fight, at least for a time, would be brutal and exhausting. Despite the formidable defences offered by the famous Atlantic Wall, Hitler's fortress Europe was breached on that opening day, but not all had gone to plan. The US forces had met with mixed results. At Utah, progress was good, though the terrain had caused major problems. At Omaha Beach, though, the landing Americans had met with withering fire and after a brutal day of heavy fighting had just managed to gain a foothold in occupied Europe. It was now that the real fight to liberate Normandy could begin. The very first step in that journey would take place right here, between Omaha and Utah, which was separated by a distance of some 10 miles. In order to make progress and to eliminate the risk of German counterattack between the beaches, a junction needed to be made and held as soon as possible. That key point was right here, the town of Carentan. Let's take a closer look. By blending a 1944 aerial image onto the modern satellite view, we can reveal exactly what the area looked like at the time. As we see here, substantial flooding had been deliberately caused by the Germans to inhibit movement through the countryside beyond the beaches. Where the ground was not actually flooded, it was so wet as to be practically impassable. That meant that to be captured, and captured it must be, Carentan needed to be assaulted via this road right here. Leading from the village of Saint-Côme-du-Mont to the outskirts of Carentan, it was a raised causeway crossing the flooded area which contained 4 separate bridges over nearby waterways. In order for the town to fall, an assault needed to be made along this causeway, through each bridge and the heavy enemy defences beyond. A very tough task for any troops. So what about the men given that task? They were these guys, paratroopers of the newly formed 101st Airborne Division. Having landed in the early hours of D-Day, they had fought non-stop since then, and by the 9th of June, men of the 3rd Battalion 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment found themselves here. At their head was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole. Born in Fort Sam Houston, Texas in 1915 and raised in San Antonio, Cole was the son of an army doctor and was always destined to join the military. Enlisting in 1935, he was soon after selected to attend West Point, joining the 15th Infantry Regiment upon graduation, amongst whose ranks at that time was a Major Dwight Eisenhower. When America entered the Second World War, Cole had volunteered to join the fledgling Airborne and by 1944 was in command of 3rd Battalion of the 502nd. This iconic footage, taken on the 5th of June as men prepared to board their aircraft for the drop into Normandy, shows Cole himself chatting with his friend and former comrade, now the supreme Allied commander in Europe. Within hours, he would be leading his men in action. But their task was far from simple. Defending Carentan at the time were one of the most capable units in the German order of battle in Normandy, the men of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. Commanded by the highly experienced and dedicated National Socialist, Colonel Friedrich von der Heydter, the men of the 6th were a mixture of hardened veterans and very young recruits, as this image taken in mid-June shows. The regiment had been in constant action since D-Day, during which time they'd lost upwards of 30% of their strength. Nevertheless, they remained a well-armed and well-trained, if a little undersupplied, force on the battlefield. Their position was much strengthened by the terrain. Let's take a closer look at the causeway. Covering a distance of some 900 yards and running northwest-southeast, this raised roadway, as we see from the modern drone image, offered a direct route towards Carentan. Unlike that we see here, in 1944 the area was much more open, with only a few trees dotting the landscape. The 4 bridges, marked on this wartime image, all needed to be crossed, with the last, that over the Madeleine, being just 200 yards from the main German defensive line, situated here around Angot Farm, nearby hedge lines and an area known as the Orchard. The Americans themselves were yet to know it, but as soon as they reached the first bridge, and right up until the farm and orchard were captured, they would be under direct sniper, machine gun, mortar and artillery fire. And so it was, at 3 AM on the 10th of June that Captain Clement's G Company began the advance, which involved a rapid but single file passage along the first of those 4 bridges on the causeway. To start with, all went well, and progress was swift, though a major problem was encountered just a few yards further on, when right here the advance was stopped. It turned out that during their withdrawal into Carentan, a German corporal had blown the second causeway bridge, that over the Douve River. Whilst it was known to the Americans, and engineers had been dispatched to erect a crossing over this very stretch of waterway, due to heavy enemy fire they had been unable to ford the Douve. By the time Colonel Cole arrived, it was clear that the original timetable for the attack was unachievable, and over the following hours he set about remedying the situation. Let's turn to the man himself.
We found that the bridge was not under very heavy shell fire, and that by being cautious and keeping well dispersed, we could perhaps put a passable footwalk across. This we did, and we finished it up about 3 o'clock. About 3:30, the initial elements of the battalion started across, 1 man at a time, about 1 minute interval. We had no trouble with enemy fire initially. However, as soon as the man got along the banks here, in any number, the enemy fired quite heavily on the roadway and on the bridge.
Finally, with the crossing of the Douve achieved, the advance could restart. But from this moment onwards, an awful reality became apparent for the attackers. There was next to no cover, all the way to the 4th bridge and the outskirts of Carentan. From this drone view we can identify the German positions which were here in the farmhouse, along these hedge lines and beyond the Madeleine River here. Anyone advancing along the road was liable to be hit by small arms, mortar and artillery fire. And they were, with casualties mounting by the yard. Many men, unable to enter the flooded fields, instead headed down the banks of the causeway to at least have protection from one side of the bank or the other. Cole and his men pushed on, reaching and crossing the 3rd bridge here, again running a gauntlet of fire to do so. Now though, the 4th and last bridge along the causeway was finally in view, though so too were the attackers. With the range ever shortening and an entire battalion now strung out along the road between the 1st and 4th bridges, enemy fire zeroed in on the road and the situation for the 502nd men became desperate. Let's take a look at that 4th bridge in detail. When the leading element of the 502nd reached this location in the early evening, they were met with a nasty shock. Not only was it under heavy fire from multiple machine guns, but the bridge itself was blocked by 2 large Belgian gates, a heavy metal construction used to prevent the passage of vehicles. This image, taken shortly after the fighting, shows the original bridge, long since replaced, with one of the 2 Belgian gates still in view. They having been pushed to one side, it was only the extreme bravery of a scouting patrol who, under heavy fire, managed to shift one of the gates just enough for a single man to squeeze through, that a passage off the causeway could finally be made. Let's spin around and take a look at the situation from the German perspective. From here we see the main defensive locations and just how strong the fields of fire onto the causeway were. Today we see vehicles crossing that ground, but of course this view in 1944 would have seen almost 300 men under heavy fire and unable to advance on their objectives. At the same time that this attack was going in, on the far side of Carentan, the men of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment were also advancing on the town. Having crossed marshy ground that morning, they had, with the help of small boats, managed to cross the river and establish a foothold on the far bank. Advancing from the north, by mid-afternoon they had met steadily heavier resistance, and progress here too had been checked. Back with Colonel Cole on the causeway, nightfall at least seemed to offer some cover for his exposed and isolated troops, but the dangers were far from over. About 11:30 PM, a rare event took place when two Stuka dive bombers of the severely outnumbered Luftwaffe appeared over the causeway, one strafing and the other bombing Cole's command, causing dozens of casualties. In fact, casualty numbers were by now a serious problem, with I Company being withdrawn from the fight, having lost 59 of its 86 men throughout that day. For the rest, sporadic shell and mortar fire further frayed nerves and thinned their ranks. The precarious position left two options. Colonel Cole recalls the situation and his decision.
At 5:15 we were firing upon and had to hit any cover we could get. We stayed there, and I thought the only solution was either to withdraw back to bridge and take the chance of getting everybody killed withdrawing, to attack this position, or just lie in the ditches and be sniped at. So I called for artillery fire, which I received, and then issued order for bayonet charge to be on the whistle signal.
Looking at the ground today, we see that the area across which Cole and his men would attack has been largely overtaken by the post-war growth of Carentan, but nestled amongst the new buildings lies the farmhouse on which the German defences were anchored. Using this and the river as reference points, we can align the historic shot to reveal the exact direction across which Cole and his men would advance. Not only do we identify Ingu Farm itself, but also the area known as the Orchard, a key part of the German defence and Cole's objective. So it was to this point in the final few hours of darkness that the remaining men of H and G companies along with battalion headquarters had moved, passing one man at a time across the fourth bridge and lining up along the banks of the river. Colonel Cole described what happened next.
And on the whistle signal, 3/4 of the battalion rose up out of the ditch and charged across this direction here and across in through there, with the initial objective being the orchard the other side of the house here. However, due to the intense fighting and the many machine gun positions and dug-in positions, many men got scattered out, and what it involved was a fight of individuals against individual machine gun nests. This fighting went on pretty heavily until about 10 o'clock, and then it slackened down.
As we heard, it was across this very ground at 6:15 AM that Cole, Colt 45 in hand, led that charge across the open ground to Ingu Farm. What he didn't mention though was that the charge was far from universal. In fact, due to confusion and perhaps the noise in the environment around him, it seems only around 25 men actually advanced with him towards the enemy positions. Fortunately, 40 men further to the right who had swam the Madeleine also joined in, and the momentum drove the men onto the enemy positions. Under cover of an artillery smokescreen, with their blood up after a day of enduring enemy fire, the Americans stormed into the German positions and at point-blank range with rifle, pistol, grenade and bayonet forced the enemy from the farmhouse in a short but extraordinarily bloody fight. Within just a few minutes, the men of the 101st, with Colonel Cole at their head, had thrown the enemy back, and at last, the fight for the causeway was over. That said, the fight for Carentan itself certainly was not. With Cole establishing his new CP in the farmhouse, and after a short informal truce to bringing wounded on both sides, Germans launched concerted efforts to drive the exhausted paratroopers from their hard-won gains. Over the next few hours and days, a bitter struggle would take place just beyond the farmyard in an area of fields long since gone, known as the Cabbage Patch, and in the town itself, as a Fallschirmjäger rearguard exacted a heavy price on their opponents in an attempt to save at least some of their exhausted force. It was not actually until the 13th of June that the centre of Carentan fell at the hands of the 506, including Easy Company of Band of Brothers fame, whose passage into the town had only been made possible by Colonel Cole's hellish advance across the causeway. but in securing Carentan and holding it in the days to come against further German counterattacks, the crucial junction between Omaha and Utah beaches was made, and the advance which would ultimately lead to the liberation of Normandy, France and northwest Europe could begin. Of course, for the men of the 101st, there were many more bitter fights to come, but for those who experienced it, the brutal struggle along the road, which is today known as Purple Heart Lane, would never be forgotten. Colonel Cole himself would return here in the weeks to come, this time with newsreels in tow, and recount those actions which today offer a fascinating insight into the events on the causeway. His determined leadership would also be remembered and ultimately acknowledged with the award of the Medal of Honor. Sadly, he would not live to receive it. Just 3 months later, during Operation Market Garden, 29-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole was shot and killed by a German sniper whilst leading his men. Today he's buried in the town of Margarten in the Netherlands American Cemetery, alongside more than 8,000 fallen comrades of the Second World War. Thanks for watching. If you find content just like this interesting, why not check out our other videos on the Battle of Normandy, including the infamous bocage fighting right here on YouTube. And if you'd like to support what we do, then please take a moment to check out our Patreon page, in which, for the price of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to behind the scenes material, exclusive content, and help decide which topics we cover in future videos. Your support is hugely appreciated and allows us to continue sharing history just like this. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.